Now, US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is meeting Russian President Vladimir Putin. In fact, his counterpart, Sergei Lavrov in Moscow. But in New York, a tense UN Security Council meeting over Syria has again demonstrated the divide between Russia and the West. UN envoy Staffan de Mistura briefed the Council ahead of an expected vote on a revived draft resolution to force the Syrian government to cooperate with an investigation into last week's suspected chemical attack in Idlib Province. And to talk a little bit more about the seemingly deepening divide and the rising tensions between Russia and the US is Professor John Stremlau from Wits University, who's very in tune with the happenings in the US. The last time we spoke, Donald Trump had just become president. Hillary Clinton was trying to figure out how do you win the popular vote by the largest margin ever and still lose. And people weren't quite sure about the future in terms of Trump foreign policy. But it seemed the one person we knew for sure he was friends with was Vladimir Putin. What has changed?
I'm not sure very much has changed, other than we've been convinced that he's as incompetent and inexperienced at running a major power as we suspected back during the campaign. He likes to think he's unpredictable. I think most of the U.S. allies think he's incoherent, and certainly I'm having a hard time figuring out what's going on here. But I think the Russian relationship on two levels, the campaign and whether or not the Trump people were in collusion, and then secondly, whether or not he has done a lot of financial dealings which may be deemed at some point to have been illegal, money laundering and that kind of thing. There's an awful lot of circumstantial evidence, so we're going to see what's going to happen.
When President Obama was handing over, one of the things that he said, and it stuck with me, he says that this job has a way of humbling you. Do you think that now being in office, he's starting to see just how complicated some of these issues are, and that maybe he's still stumbling along, but slowly getting to grips with just how big this job is?
Well, clearly he's over his head, and he doesn't have staff. And the State Department, for example, has Rex Tillerson, as you just said. No one beneath him, really. Nikki Haley up at the UN hasn't even talked to her staff. These guys are making it up as they go, and lady are making it up as they go along. And I think that what he has discovered is not only that it's hard, but he can do something like the 59 Tomahawks without thinking about the second or third step. Obama was always thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead, and hence was very hesitant to get involved. After all, the Assad family has been in power for 47 years, and they've negotiated effectively with 9 different presidents. Trump, unfortunately, doesn't have a plan or a doctrine other than he now saw an opportunity to do something that the international community would say is certainly acceptable, because chemical weapons have been prohibited since World War I. That's nearly 100 years.
So what are the consequences of the US strikes in Syria? Russia is upset. They've warned America not to do it again. But President Trump has set a precedent. If chemical weapons are used again, what can happen? I mean, can Russia actually do something? And can President Trump not do anything, seeing that he's shown a precedent here?
Well, and the short answer is we don't know, but it is important to note that the Americans did inform the Russians ahead of the attack that the Russians were supposed to guarantee there were no chemical weapons, and whether or not Assad cleared this with the Russians beforehand, we don't know, we can speculate. But I think there may be going on here the undercurrents of this question about whether, in fact, there has been a kind of a state capture here with the special relationship between the cronies in the Trump administration and Trump himself in dealing with these Russian oligarchs historically, and then also whether there'd been collusion in the campaign. Only in the last couple of days, Carter Page, one of the principals in the campaign, was identified and admitted that the FBI had been, in fact, watching him very closely because he had dealings with a Russian spy during the period that he was getting ready to work for Donald Trump.
Do his Russia problems go away with this seemingly standing up to Russia and doing what he knew Russia would be upset with?
That's the great question, because there is those who think that this was kind of an easy mark to show that there is differences between the two. Now, Putin kept him waiting today in Moscow while he was meeting with Lavrov, and he would have been the first Secretary of State on a first visit not to see the head of state of the Soviet Union, or now Russia. That goes back to World War II, for heaven's sakes. So then Putin did deign to see with them, but we don't know what they talked about, and they do know each other. And the web of relations with the Russians throughout the hierarchy now, from Tillerson to Madison to others, is really quite extensive. So it is a complex relationship. It is a relationship that I think, for those of us who worry about things like state capture and crony capitalism, is worth watching. It's unfolding before our eyes, and it's hard to predict.
Tillerson said, look, Russia is taking the side of Assad, Iran, and but essentially saying, are these the guys that Russia wants to hang out with? They're basically saying, listen, you know, you've got to go our way if you want to make sense. And that's quite a thing to say to a superpower. Well,
especially since a week ago he said that's up to the Syrian people to decide, which may have emboldened Assad. Let us not forget that the Trump administration, in its incoherence, was sending so many mixed signals that Assad may have decided on his own to test, or the Russians decided this was an easy way to throw up a smokescreen. We just don't know. And at the UN, Ambassador Nikki Haley is taking a very hard line. Who do you believe? And Trump, a week ago, was taking a very different line, and he may take a different line in another week. This is not a way to do diplomacy.
A line has been drawn in the sand here. America has declared a position. Russia's declared a position. Who is likely to step back from their position?
Well, maybe nothing will happen, because after all, 59 Tomahawks at one air base, which was operative later the next day, sending bombers over. If Assad takes this as a warning and doesn't use chemical weapons, you know, there are 22 million people there were in Syria before this crisis. 11 million of them, half the population, has been displaced, and 500,000 people have died at estimates. And so when you talk about the 80 to 100 who died by this chemical attack, that's terrible. But let's not lose perspective. This is the worst political crisis of the 21st century. No one has a solution. And in fact, the Security Council has been debating this for years. It's been going on since 2011.
What's President Trump going to do next? Can he afford to lose this friendship, this bromance that he has with Vladimir Putin? Or do you think they'll find a way to get back to what they'd hoped?
I think what Trump is most concerned about is he doesn't want to be impeached. If they come up with the FBI finding that in fact there was real collusion, that will be a problem for him. And if these investigations into his financial dealings, he's yet to produce any kind of evidence about his income taxes. If they can put the dots together on financial malfeasance, that too would be a reason for the Republicans to do as they did with Richard Nixon, decide he's too big a liability for us going into the 2018 or 2020 elections, the congressional first, and then cut bait. And so, you know, you could have Governor Pence, or now Vice President Pence, in the White House before that long. I mean, who knows?
All right, we've run out of time, but very briefly, North Korea. He said to China, help us with this, but if you don't, we're going to go it alone. What does he mean, go it alone?
Well, he is rattling the sword right now, and North Korea is an errant regime, as you know, and has been testing missiles. It's a very dangerous, and indeed many ways, because of nuclear weapons, perhaps more dangerous for the international community and non-proliferation than even the Syrian catastrophe. But we'll see the meeting with Xi, and after all, this bombing that he did with the Tomahawks happened at the same time, is a reminder that he is doing business with the Chinese, and I think they're trying to cool things.
All right, Prof, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very much indeed for your insights as always. And I suppose this is a story that continues to unfold and may have a few flips and flops still to come.
It's worth following.
Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.